Okay, so we are going to pick back up with the protozoans. This is chapter 5, section 5.7. And so we are just going to go through several of the categories of protozoans that have some sort of medical significance and talk a little bit about the major groups of protozoans and some of the things that we look at to identify them, as well as the ecological importance or significance of them. So there are pathogenic flagellates called trypanosomes. A flagellate is something just that has a flagellum or multiple flagella. And so the genus for those is Trypanosoma. And a couple of significant ones are Trypanosoma brucei and Trypanosoma cruzi. And the brucei causes African sleeping sickness, and the cruzi causes Chagas disease. And these cells are sort of elongated with a crescent shape and one single flagellum. They, during an infection, they infect the blood, and they are actually transmitted from blood-sucking vectors that are going to be insects. And so this is showing that life cycle. Um, and so you have this, cat with possibly this particular insect that's a blood-sucking insect that has the trypanosome and ends up transmitting it to the human. And then, the cycle also goes on in the wild and can be passed back and forth between different wild animals. In this case, it's showing possums and armadillos. And so, but it can also be transmitted between humans and domestic animals. Okay, so then also this is one that you've probably all heard of is there are different species of amoebas that cause human infections, and the genus is Entamoeba, and Entamoeba histolytica commonly causes amoebic dysentery, which the main common symptom of that is going to be gastrointestinal disturbances. And there have been a number of cases of people getting infections caused by amoebas. Most species of amoebas don't cause infection. Most of them are free living, but there are commonly Entamoeba histolytica infections that will happen. And we had talked about this term trophozoite. So the trophozoites of Entamoeba histolytica will end up in the large intestine and grow and reproduce. And in addition to causing gastrointestinal symptoms, they can invade the liver, lungs, and skin. And there have been cases where people have ended up with amoeba infections in their brains. And there were a couple of them even in the state of Louisiana where this happened. And this is showing the life cycle of an infective amoeba. And you have the cysts that will end up being a contamination in food and water supplies being taken in by the human host and then ending up in the large intestine and maturing and reproducing and causing infections there. And then the way that the infection gets passed on is that the cysts exit in feces and then end up back in food and water supplies and can be transmitted to another host. Now we're going to move on from the protozoans to the animal kingdom, where we're going to talk about parasitic helminths or parasitic worms. And so even though these organisms are multicellular animals and they have organs for reproduction, digestion, movement, protection, they are categorized as microbes and something that we study in microbiology because there's going to be at least one part of the life cycle. A lot of times it will be the eggs that is microscopic, and a lot of times the eggs are used to diagnose an infection, a parasitic worm infection. So that's why we include them here. So parasitic worms, obviously they're going to parasitize the host tissues, and they have mouth parts that allow them to attach to or digest host tissues. Most of them have well-developed sex organs that produce eggs and sperm. And the fertilized eggs, once they're fertilized and mature, they develop into a larval stage. And the larval stage may be in the host body or outside of the host. So the two major categories of parasitic helminths are flatworms and roundworms. The flatworms are, as the name implies, flat with no defined body cavity. They have a one-ended digestive tract called a blind pouch, meaning that it only has an opening at one end. So all of the material that is taken in is forced down the digestive tract and then it has to come back up to be excreted. And then they have simple excretory, which is part of that blind pouch, and nervous systems. Two categories underneath flatworms are the cestodes or tapeworms, which we've all heard of, and then the trematodes, which are also called flukes. And so tapeworms are just named basically for their shape. They're long, they're flattened, ribbon-like worms, and then the flukes are characterized by flat bodies that are kind of like ovoid or oval shaped. And then one thing about all helminths is that they are very much geared toward reproduction. And so that's why they have a really highly defined reproductive system. And the cestodes, or tapeworms in particular, are very geared toward reproductive systems. And then the other parts, like the digestion, excretory, and nervous systems, are kind of reduced. And that's especially true of the cestodes. Then the roundworms, which are also known as nematodes, have a round body cross section, and they have complete digestive tracts, unlike the flatworms. They usually will have a protective cuticle on the outside of their bodies, and they also can have spines and hooks on their mouth parts. Hookworms are an example of roundworms. And then the excretory and nervous systems, just like in the flatworms, are often underdeveloped or poorly developed. The classification for helminths is based on the body shape, body size, organ development, the presence of different types of mouth parts like hooks or suckers and other specialized structures they might have, the mode of reproduction, the hosts that they parasitize, and also a lot of times the morphology of the eggs and larval stages of the worms are used to classify them. And then a lot of times infections of parasitic worms are actually diagnosed by detecting the larvae or eggs in the feces of the host. So that's one thing that's important to note. A lot of times, if you've had a pet, a cat or a dog, you take it to the vet to get checked for worms. A lot of times what they're going to do is take a fecal sample, and there's a particular technique that they use to make a slide of the contents of the fecal sample and search that slide for the presence of eggs or larvae for different common types of parasitic worms. And this is a figure from your book. On the left-hand side, this is a beef tapeworm, which is a cestode, and it shows, this long tape-like body, the mouth or the scolex and the sucker parts. It's also showing the immature eggs and then the fertile or mature egg. And one segment is called a proglottid, and then it's also showing the cuticle. This other picture over here is showing the structure of a liver fluke, which is a trematode, and you can see, the mouth part or the sucker here, and it has a bunch of the other parts labeled as well. So just to kind of summarize and give some perspective to the parasitic worms, there are about 50 species worldwide that are human parasites, and some of them, thankfully, are restricted to specific geographic areas, and there are a lot of them that are concentrated in the tropical regions. And so they can be acquired in different ways. A lot of times it'll be through ingesting the eggs or larvae from food or water. They're also going to be found in soil. A lot of times the soil will contaminate food or, or the water. And some of them are carried by insect vectors as well, and billions of humans are infected by parasitic worms every year. This is just showing the life cycle of a pinworm. And so in this case, this is a little kid sucking their thumb, which they've probably gotten pinworm eggs on their hands from playing in the dirt. And then you know, this child that was infected can end up infecting another child by touching their hands, and with the eggs, getting cross contamination of the eggs on this other child. And so that used to be a really common one. I don't think as many kids in the U.S. get it today as they used to. And then that is it. That's all that I have for chapter 5. And so I will be posting some more lectures after this. Thanks so much.